The goal is the church thrives, the ministry thrives, and the individual thrives.
Totally.
You know, if somebody's struggling in a role, they're not personally thriving. What it could be is you have two people on your staff, and maybe they need to completely just switch roles.
Yeah.
Man, they're just not in the right seat, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, and you see this, like you go back to the college football analogy. I mean, you may have somebody that, you know, goes their whole peewee football, you know, middle school, high school, they played one position, and then at some point at a higher level, they just get put into a different position.
Yeah.
And they just thrive, you know,
Yeah.
they just take off. And so it's ultimately about, man, do we have the right people, you know, in the right seats? And we're not saying you don't coach somebody. We're not saying you don't write a new play, you don't get new vision, whatever. But the idea is the vast majority of the time, if you get the right person that's gifted in the right way, then you could just take your hands off it and they're gonna do awesome.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. This is Pastor Bobby. I'm here with Pastor Brant, who is on our leadership team at Mercy Hill. And one of the things that we want to talk about today is how to lead staff and how to create a really good staff culture in terms of developing your staff and putting them in the right seats for them to do the mission of the church and to use the gifts that God has given them. And so I would say this is really one of those things that, you know, I went to seminary, Brant went to seminary. This is one of those things that they just don't teach you this in seminary.
Yep.
And you could come out of seminary thinking, well, as long as, you know, somebody loves Jesus, they could do any staff role in the church. And the reality is that's just not true. And there's a lot of things about leadership, you know, about leading people that you certainly can learn in the Bible, but you don't necessarily learn in seminary. You know, there's typically not a class on, hey, as you have a staff of 3 or 5 or 10 people, like, how do you lead that staff and how do you put them, you know, in the positions that they need to be in so that they're thriving and they're excelling and they're using their gifts. And I find that as churches grow, this is, you know, lead pastors and leadership team, executive team, this is something that a lot of people struggle with, you know, because we know the mission of the church is all about people, but the way you go about the mission of the church is also all about people.
Yeah.
And so how we lead people as pastors, as leaders in the church is just so important. And so what I'm going to share today, I'm going to share 3 things that we have learned over the years that I would just say are like indisputable truths to leading staff. This isn't Bible. This is just wisdom and things that we have learned over the years. But these 3, no matter how much we don't want them to be true, you know, no matter what, we've just learned that these 3 things, they just are true.
Well, I think too, I mean, just thinking about the importance of something like this, it's like we as leaders on a staff, one of the main things that we do is put people in the right spots to succeed, to be able to bring their giftings to be able to further the mission. So if we don't see the need for that, if we don't want to be the best that we possibly can be at putting people in the right spots, I mean, that's a major part of our role as leaders. And if we don't do it, it'll really prevent and stunt the growth of the church. And also, you know, if we do it well, it actually helps people to be able to thrive within the church as well, and help the church grow in immense ways. So I think this topic is extremely important for us to talk about.
Yeah, so three truths when it comes to leading staff, and I'm sure if you're listening to this, you have experienced these types of situations for good and bad, or you will certainly experience them. So the first truth is this, and this is a famous quote that's been used in college football for a long time. It's not the X's and the O's, but the Jimmies and the Joes. We say this internally a lot. And what we mean by this is, as leaders, no matter how great the vision is, no matter, you know, you write up a play for student camp, you write up a play for Easter, no matter how creative those plays are, no matter how great they are, it ultimately comes down to, like, man, you cannot outcoach not having the right person in the right role. And I would say for us, the way that we have learned this lesson over time, honestly, sometimes it's just too much belief in our own sort of plans where, maybe you see, a ministry that's not going where you think it should go, or, maybe whatever. They're not raising up enough volunteers, or they're not hitting certain numbers, or they're not, this thing was disorganized, whatever it may be, right? Something is maybe not going the way that you think it should go. We've always had, okay, let's get in there. Like, man, we need to coach them. We need to help them. Nothing wrong with that. We need to help write another play. Maybe they need to have another play. Let's get on the chalkboard, man. Here's the X's, here's the O's. Do this, run around this, do this, block this person. And a lot of times, I would say 95% of the time, it's just, do we have the right person in this role? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can end up over systematizing things or putting the blame in the wrong place a lot of times, and it's out of a good heart. Like we love people, and I think we can end up tricking ourselves into the fact that it must have been this over here, or it must have been this over here, because we almost tell ourselves, well, it's not loving to just say actually it's like the wrong person or the right person in the wrong seat, and I think our kind of nerves to enter into a conversation like that can prevent us from actually thinking right about it. And I've kind of shifted a little bit on it of just is actually not loving to actually keep the person in a seat in which they're actually not thriving in. Right. And we've got to be willing to enter in. If not, what happens is you get leaders that need to be leading, but you end up micromanaging, 50 different things, and no one's able to actually lead well because we're not willing to actually talk about, hey, is this the right person in the right seat for their thriving, for the ministry's thriving? I love that, someone, I think it was Craig Rochelle or somebody like that mentioned, in situations like that, do we need to move them? Do we need to coach them? Do we need to cut them? And I think that can hit people sometimes really hard, but I think we can't just let somebody flounder in a seat long term. That's not healthy for them or the organization.
Yeah, the goal is the church thrives, the ministry thrives, and the individual thrives.
Totally.
And, if somebody's struggling in a role, they're not personally thriving.
Yeah.
And what it could be is you have two people on your staff, and maybe they need to completely just switch roles.
Yeah.
Because, man, they're just not in the right seat,
Yeah.
I mean, and you see this, you go back to the college football analogy. I mean, you may have somebody that, goes their whole, peewee football, middle school, high school, they played one position, and then at some point at a higher level, they just get put into a different position.
Yeah.
And they just thrive,
Yeah.
they just take off. And so it's ultimately about, man, do we have the right people, in the right seats? And we're not saying you don't coach somebody. We're not saying you don't write a new play, you don't get new vision, whatever. But the idea is the vast majority of the time, if you get the right person that's gifted in the right way, then you could just take your hands off it, and they're just going to do awesome.
And I think you mentioned this in terms of thriving for the organization and the individual. I think that's the question we've got to be asking ourselves is, how do I help this ministry area of our church thrive? And how do I help this person thrive?
Right.
And being open-minded to what that actually looks like. And you even mentioned, do we have people even switch roles? Are we open-handed enough to say, hey, we're going to think outside the box for the thriving of this person and the thriving of the ministry? Mm-hmm. And that's the heart behind it all, which matters in such a great way that we have that heart behind it.
So for us trying to figure out, okay, do we have the right person in the right seat? So we ask a couple questions. One question we ask is this the right person? And when we're asking this question, we're not asking, can this person do this particular job or this particular role? We're basically just asking the question, does this person fit the culture of our staff? Because, at one point in the past, I think we thought, man, if this person's a believer that loves God, they can be on our staff no matter what. And it's no, our staff has a certain culture.
Yeah.
And people are going to need to be able to fit in that culture for everybody's sake. It's just to make the team, better and just have a better culture. So we would define our culture, people that are extremely driven. They have high emotional intelligence. They have alignment with our ministry philosophy, and then they're wise, or we say church smart sometimes. They know how to operate within a church staff. So that's not basically answering the question, can they do the job? That's just saying, are they the right person for our staff? And then the next question, I'll let you kind of expand on this. We ask, are they in the right seat? And we often will use the get it, want it capacity to do it. So maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. And this is pulled from EOS Traction, Gino Wickman stuff, who's a really good resource as well. But GWC, get it, want it capacity to do it. Get it is, do they have a good understanding, a full understanding? They grasp the role. Like they wake up and they could tell you, the top 4 things that they're doing. So they have this full understanding of what the role requires as well. I'm ready to go after it. Do they want it? That's an issue. If somebody doesn't want the role, they may get the role. They may have an understanding of the role. But if they don't wake up in the morning and they're not excited to go to work and do that role, they're not going to be a great fit for it. They may be a good fit on the team, but they may not be a great fit for that seat. And the third one is capacity to do it. And so we have to be just honest as we think about assessment, and this is the role that we have as leaders, is does somebody actually have the capacity to be able to do that role? And we have to assess that. And that's the area that one of the things it says is even like that's the area that can be coached the most, but we have to also be honest that we all have limited capacities and not everybody can do every role or is a fit for every role. And so we as leadership and directors and anybody that's leading staff and hiring staff here has to be thinking about, are they the right person? Do they fit the staff? But then are they in the right seat? Do they get it? Do they want it? Do they have the capacity to do this seat? And if not, they maybe need to find a different seat on the team and what that looks like.
That's great, man. Yeah. I mean, a lot of times we think about capacity to do it, can they actually do this role? But the get it, want it thing is important because I've learned over time that you have certain individuals that, they come onto a church staff, they get into vocational ministry, and their idea of vocational ministry was, man, I just thought I was going to be, having coffee with somebody every morning and I was going to be having lunch with somebody every day and I was just going to be counseling them.
Yeah.
And they may be in a role on the church's staff where it's like, no, you need to be developing leaders. You need to be raising up volunteers, and they understand the role, but they want to just be having coffee and meeting somebody for lunch every day and doing counseling. It's like, well, there's nothing wrong with that. And certainly that could be a role, but that's not the role that you're in.
It's true. Yeah.
The thing that we need you to do. The church is giving towards this, and we feel like this is important for the sake of the body.
Yeah.
There needs to be this role over here that's raising up volunteers.
Yeah.
And somebody has to want to do that,
It's a big deal, man, because it's a drive thing. I think at the end of the day, it kind of does overlap maybe a little bit of that where, if somebody doesn't want it, it's hard to wake up in the morning and get motivated and think that I'm going to give 100% to this thing if I don't even want to do it. And I think it's hard for staff sometimes to be able to just say that. But I so appreciate it when staff do say that, because that honesty actually allows us to be able to say, okay, all right, now we've got a place where we can figure out, what are the next steps? Let's talk about where everything else is in terms of even staff, layout and what could be other options. And so I think that wanted is a huge deal. It's a huge deal to be able to put people in the right spot where they feel like they're driving results and operating the way that God's designed them. Yeah,
for sure. So that's all under that first principle. It's not the X's and O's, but the Jimmys and the Joes. The second principle, and this is a very hard one, and so we'll try to flesh this out. But I really say this to myself a lot internally, and myself, Pastor Andrew, we've had to kind of learn this over the years. Here's how I would say it. It's always right to do the right thing. And what I mean by that is, as we're leading other people, honestly, this could be leading a lay elder, this could be leading a volunteer, this could be leading a staff member, and you may be confronted with a situation where, it may be early on in leading that person, but you realize at some point, and there could be 1,000 different situations, but you realize, oh, wait a minute, maybe this person doesn't have the character they need to be, in this role.
Yeah.
Or going back to the previous one, maybe this person doesn't have the capacity to actually do this role. God has created all of us differently. We all have different spiritual gifts. No one person has all the gifts.
Yeah.
Right? Certain roles, you're going to need certain gifts to be able to do those roles. And no amount of coaching, no amount of encouraging, no amount of inspiration is going to change the spiritual gifts that somebody has.
Yeah.
And there are times where everything inside of you is going to want to where you don't want to have the tough conversation with somebody.
Yeah.
You'll think, oh man, we made the wrong hire, or we put somebody in the wrong seat, and let's just ignore it, and maybe after a year it'll work itself out, or maybe after 2 years it'll work itself out. And this is why it's always right to do the right thing. Maybe it's confronting someone on their sin,
Yeah.
confronting a leader, confronting somebody on a moral issue. Like, we just don't, unless you have something deeply wrong inside of you. Most of us do not want to be in these types of conversations.
Yeah.
Like, we just want to avoid them. Like, who wants to sit down and have a difficult situation with, conversation with somebody? But that's why we say, man, it's always right to do the right thing. So any kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. I think for a couple of things is just, first, I got to check my heart in this. And like in my heart, am I loving this person? And I think what can happen is we end up actually putting off the conversations, because of fear of man a lot of times.
For sure.
But that's actually not loving the person. And we almost play it in our mind as if it is.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I'm just going to cast this to the side. But it's like, are we actually after that person's good? And sometimes after someone's good, if we're after that, it demands a conversation for their good. The other question or thing I try to do is check my heart, but I also try to check my faith too in that. And it's like, am I trusting the Lord that He is sovereign, that His providence is like He's working all of these things out for their good too, like they are His child, and He's got it. Like, whatever conversation it is, whether it's the highest level church leader, whether it's a new attendee that's been coming around, like, God is God over this church. Like, it's His church. It's not my church. It's not my job to hold it all together. I can't. I wasn't designed to do that. He's over it all. So am I trusting Him and exerting faith in Him as I step into those conversations? Because a lot of times the conversations, I know for me, the ones over the years that I've put off, they don't go away. Right. One thing, they don't go away. But the second thing is, a lot of times the reason is simply because either fear of man or lack of faith. And I think we as leaders, that's something I've had to grow in and continue to grow in. But I think we as leaders just have to buy into, like, man, we're going to have faith that God is God, and we're going to love the heck out of people. And that means we're going to step into hard conversations.
Yeah. If you know that there's a right decision to be made, we have to just make that decision and then just let God sort out the rest. You know, we cannot control all the outcomes of a decision that we make. I would say most of the time when you have a difficult conversation like this, unless it's just purely confronting somebody on some sort of sinful behavior, but most of the time, if it's just moving somebody to a different role, or maybe they don't need to be in vocational ministry, right? It's like maybe the best place for them is to go back into just the corporate world, right? And just be living for the mission that way. But like, we can't control the outcomes. And so if it's the right thing to do, like, we just have to trust God that God's going to just sort it all out.
Yeah.
And I would also say that this is where leadership pain comes from.
Totally.
Like, if you are going to be a leader and there's going to be people under you, and at times you're going to have to make hard decisions, with the good of the overall church in mind, and not just, man, I don't want to hurt this person's feelings.
Yeah.
Then sometimes you're going to have to deal with leadership pain, because there's going to be times when you make a decision, and let's just say it's 100% the right decision. There may be somebody else that for the next 10 years thinks that was the wrong decision.
Yeah.
And now their opinion of you has changed.
Yeah.
And to be a leader, you have to be able to deal with that.
Yep.
You may never be able to change their opinion, They may always view you as, I mean, they could gossip about you, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And, is your identity secure enough in Christ and just secure in the leadership that God has called you to,
Yeah.
And it's not to say you don't make mistakes. Of course you make mistakes. But if you feel like you're doing the right thing, then all you could do is just trust God for the outcome.
Yeah.
And
I was talking with one of our pastors the other day about this, and just like the fact that you've got to be, when in situations like this, you've got to be okay being misunderstood.
Yeah.
And it's just going to happen because people are going to think they read your heart in things, and they're going to misread it. And at the end of the day, did we love that person? Did I, when I put my head on my pillow, did I do my best to love that person? And did I trust the Lord with it? And the book Leadership Pain, it talks about how basically as you grow in leadership, your threshold for pain has to grow as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think about the things that I look back on 5 years ago, 7 years ago that I was dealing with in different, like what I felt like was leadership pain. And now I'm like, man, like that was no big thing.
Right.
Like God worked it all out totally fine. And then I think about the things that I deal with now, and I'm like, in 5 years, I'm going to look back and I'm going to be like, that was no big thing. And God worked it out and it was fine. And so I think if we can kind of look ahead a little bit and see like God is growing, like there's always pain. It's inevitable, but let's like step into it for the sake of someone's good and the good of the church. Mm-hmm. And God always works it out.
Yeah, for sure. Another thing that I would say under this one is, like I've talked to some of our church planners before, where they're having to make like a tough transition on their staff.
Yeah.
Maybe they hired somebody for a particular role and like that person's just not doing well in that role.
Yeah.
And at times it's like they kind of can act like it's that person's fault. And I always have to remind them, hey, you're the one that hired them for this role.
Yeah.
If we're not talking about a moral issue, right? But like if you hire somebody for a particular role and then they're not doing well in that role, but they're just doing them, like they're being the person they always were, then we have to recognize, hey, it's not their fault that they can't do this role. It's your fault.
Yeah.
You hired them for this role. So what I would say to that is like, hey, you better have a lot of grace and a really good severance if you're going to move somebody out of that role off of your staff.
Yeah.
Because it is not their fault.
Agreed.
Unless they just like falsified a bunch of stuff on a resume.
Yeah.
You probably should have just done a better job. And the Bible talks a lot about, 1 Timothy 3 talks about this, like, man, judging somebody's gifts, how they're wired, their character, whatever it may be. And it's like, we're not perfect. Sometimes we hire the wrong person. Sometimes we put the wrong person in the wrong seat.
Yeah.
And it's not that person's fault.
It's true.
And so we have to take that ownership on ourselves and just be so gracious to that person.
I think too, like just the other side of it, I think sometimes as people, like we can almost look like rose-colored glasses on what could be around staff hires. And we, if we're not careful, we see all the faults of the people around us, right? It's very easy, myself included, right? And we all have faults. And we can begin to think through like, oh, well, like if we made this hire, this person would be this fit, they wouldn't do this, they would do this instead. I think we just need to realize like anybody that we hire is an imperfect human being. We're imperfect human beings. And are the things that the person brings to the job, culturally, right person, that seat, are they the right fit in that seat? Are they accomplishing the core pieces of that role? And are there things that's like, hey, they're not a perfect person and we can live with this and we're going to help them grow over time, just like I have to grow over time? Or are these things actually like major, like, hey, this is a cultural issue. This is very clear. This is not the right seat for this person. They can't accomplish the core four, or they don't, of that role, or they don't want it. I just think we've got to clarify what that actually is versus like, hey, there's somebody that, bothers me about this or something like that. And therefore, I'm thinking about that perfect person out there that has no issues. And I'm like, whoever you hire next is going to have their own set of issues.
Yep.
And so you need to think about, what are you trading in that too? And are you thinking about this person's good that you're currently leading?
And I would say this principle of it's always right to do the right thing. It's not just negative stuff. Sometimes it's positive stuff. Sometimes you may have a situation where you have somebody that's maybe a little bit younger on your staff that people would not expect for them to get moved in a higher leadership position, but they have proven that, man, God has wired them exactly for that position.
Yeah.
But you're going to be scared, afraid to do it because it may ruffle some people's feathers, because there's going to be other people that have been like, hey, I've been here for 5 years. Why, why wasn't I considered?
Yeah.
And that's a situation where it's always right to do the right thing.
It's true.
Our service is to the church as a whole and to the mission and to Jesus.
Yeah.
And, maybe that, 24-year-old person on your staff, maybe God's brought them just for, such a time as this. And we have to have the courage to be able to move them into the place where God wants them to be.
Yeah.
And sometimes that just is hard thing to do.
Well, I think honesty and transparency around that stuff, I think, is super helpful. And I think understanding your culture and your cultural values. And I think when those conversations come up, being able to have an honest conversation about like, hey, this is what we saw in that person. And hey, this is what we see in you. And I think sometimes too, the whole like leadership pipeline of things, that people see, I want to get to the next tier, the next rung in the ladder or whatever that is. It's like, people tend in American culture to see that as better. As if I get to the next rung, that's what it's all about. In reality, it's really about just leveraging your giftings fully for the kingdom. And so if we can get a little bit out of that mindset of, hey, I'm an associate director. I want to be a director. I got to be a director. I'm a, whatever. I got to be this. And we can just think about, okay, what does this role actually require? And like, what is that, how does that align up with how God's wired me? And let me do that to the fullest and let God take care of the rest of that. Mm-hmm. To me, that's such a freer way to live. Mm-hmm. And I think, helping our staff and helping, as others have staff members, helping them to see it's not about a title. It's about leveraging your giftings for the kingdom.
Yep. That's good. All right. The third one. And I think a lot of this is kind of my personal leadership philosophy. There's books about this. There's multiple kind of secular books about this, but it's kind of the idea of motivating people. Like, how do we get the best out of somebody?
Yeah.
And people approach this from lots of different ways of like, man, how do I extract the most out of somebody? And the way that I would say it, and I would say this is the best long-term motivator when you're trying to lead somebody else, somebody that reports to you on your church staff. I would say this: help someone accomplish their vision and they will help you accomplish your vision. And what I mean by this is, our natural inclination is to be like, okay, I got this person in this role, right? Maybe they're in community groups role, or maybe they're in this kids role or worship role or whatever. Our natural inclination is to be like, all right, I'm gonna try to extract the most that I can out of them, so that I get the most out of them in this role.
Yeah.
And I would say in some sense, there's not anything wrong with that. I mean, people are giving, being generous.
Yeah.
The church has determined that, man, this is a role that we're going to pay somebody to do.
Yeah.
So there is an element of like, yeah, we're trying to get the most out of this role. But what I'm talking about is like how to actually go about like motivating somebody. And I do think there are some short-term motivators where you could motivate somebody based on fear or based on, this, you're trying to inspire them, or you're trying to make them feel guilty, or you're trying to get them to see like, hey, this is so important. You got to do this. I have just found long-term, and I'll let you speak to this because this is kind of funny. You technically report to me on our staff.
Yeah.
I have just found long-term when the people that report to me, if they feel like, hey, I'm just not trying to extract the most out of them, but I really do care about like what they are trying to accomplish like in their life.
Yeah.
People are motivated for different reasons. And I'm oftentimes the people that I'm in proximity to, I'm trying to understand what motivates them because, people are just motivated by lots of different things. And it's broader than just their particular role on staff.
Yeah.
Like we each have a vision that's bigger for our lives than just like our little staff role here.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to always understand, okay, like, man, what is Brant's vision for his life? Like, what's the vision for his family? Like, him and his wife, like what is their vision? And like, if there's any way that I can help with that, people are going to be so much more, motivated to, help to kind of serve or work for you.
Yeah.
When they feel like, man, it's not just kind of a selfish thing, but you're helping them try to go after their vision.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like the biggest thing in leadership is trust. And I think understanding that the person who leads you organizationally is for you. Not just like for the bottom line, not just for the numbers, or things like that, but actually for you. To me, that's the thing that matters most. And I think that's the thing that compels people to actually want to give their best and actually be honest and transparent and be able to be coached as well, because they believe that the person that's leading them is actually for them, and not just trying to get something from them. It makes all the difference to the world. I think one of the things too, though, this is something I can grow in. I feel like, I think in terms of understanding what somebody's like vision is for their life, it takes time to be able to have conversations with people. It takes leaning in and listening to be able to do that as well. And I think what we can do is, I feel like maybe I'm just speaking from my own like past and stuff too, is like, if we're not careful, we can assume that everybody has the same motivations as I do. And that's just not the case. And so I think taking the time to actually lean in, and some of them probably overlap, especially in ministry. A lot of times, impact is usually one that people have in ministry. If not, they would probably go to a secular job and probably make, more money doing something like that. But I think leaning in and listening and asking those questions to then be able to figure out, how do I give them wins in their lives? To me, I was able to do this on a very, on a very small level with one of our staff members recently, and just able to give just through a connection, be able to give them a win for, something that they were going after. And to me, I felt like I was so excited about that for them. And I felt like it meant more to them than even like me giving them a bonus or something like I feel like just that connection that I made, because it really had nothing to do with your job performance. It had everything to do with who you are as a person and what your family needs and where you're going. And that type of stuff, I feel like as leaders, it's that convergence of like, hey, like we're doing ministry together and I'm for you. And it's bigger than just this. And how do I help you get where you want to go?
Yeah, it's counterintuitive because sometimes we think, yeah, but their vision for their life could be, beyond our church, or it could be beyond this role. And like, we're kind of scared, man, if I kind of help them accomplish that, then like, what's the effect going to be here,
Yeah.
But I would say, man, it's going to have a reciprocal benefit for everybody. Like take somebody on your staff, they may want to be in that particular role forever. And so you try to help them be in that role forever. There's going to be other people that are like, hey, I want to, you're going to have people that are like, I want to do your role one day.
Yeah.
And maybe that's at another church. Maybe that's at a church plant.
Yeah.
And if they can feel that like, hey, you want to help them get there, then they're going to run after their current job a lot harder than they would if they didn't feel like you wanted that for them.
Yeah.
And that's why I just say, like, man, if you help them go after their vision, they're going to help you go after your vision, which is, the health of the church and the direction of the church. So yeah, I just find that these three things, they're just almost laws of nature, when you're dealing with people.
Yeah.
And when we just accept them, that they're true, I think it just really helps us when we're dealing with people. Sometimes it's making really exciting decisions. Sometimes it's making really hard decisions.
Yeah.
And I think if we operate by something like this, we're also going to have a lot more trust from people,
sure,
that they know where they stand with us. Sometimes it's a hard conversation, but they know where they stand.
Yeah.
Last words on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would say this from Mercy Hill's culture of just sending. I think that this whole concept of helping someone accomplish their vision is this open-handedness that all that we have is from the Lord, and it's all for Him. And so, as we send people, He brings people, and we've just seen this over and over again. And so I think for us as leaders, just putting that first of like, hey, we're for people accomplishing the biggest splash that they can for the kingdom, whether that's at our church or whether that's somewhere else. We want to help them get there and understand that God is going to continue His work through us and through others.
That's great. All right. Thank you guys. Thank you, Brant, for being here with us today. And thank you guys for listening.